Before I begin our introductions, I want to tell you a little story. It's called the 4-minute mile. The unit of distance that we call the mile was standardized in 1593. The establishment of the mile led to the popularity of the classic 1-mile running race. The stopwatch was invented in 1821. Given a mile and a stopwatch, people now had a way of keeping track of who could run the mile the fastest. In 1855, Charles Westall ran the mile in 4 minutes and 28 seconds. Many runners improved on this record over the years. 50 years later, John Paul Jones improved the record to 4 minutes and 15 seconds. In the 20s, it was down to 4:10, the 40s to 4:05. But no one seemed to be capable of breaking the 4-minute mark. Scientists even posed that it was not possible for human beings to do so. Meanwhile, in England, in 1954, Roger Bannister was a medical student. He liked to cut class and go running in the local park. On May 6th, Roger had a ham salad sandwich for lunch. May not be the exact sandwich, not sure. At 5:15, he got rained on, and then he ran the mile in 3 minutes and 59 seconds. It was said that besides running, that the core of his training was an intensive and a regular visualization of achieving the goal. That day, he broke through the 4-minute barrier, and that remains, and that's something that humans have been trying for hundreds of years previously. Only 35 days later, John Landry broke the record by more than a second. And today, top high schoolers regularly run sub 4-minute miles. In fact, now hundreds of people have. I'm editing my PowerPoint now. Here are the world record times leading up to breaking that 4-minute barrier. And after the barrier was broken, here are the numbers of people who have broken the record since. There's literally hundreds of them. In fact, one person has broken the record, broken the 4-minute mile by 136 different times. So what changed? Did people learn new training techniques? Do we have better equipment? Sure, those things helped. But it's clear that there was a psychological barrier that was holding even the greatest of champions back. What changed was someone had actually done it. In 1954, Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute barrier, but he also broke down a barrier for all runners. It's an interesting story, and I hope at this point you're wondering if you're at the right conference or not. You're wondering what this has to do with disability. So I'm glad you asked, maybe not out loud, but I'm Alex Tabony. I'm the Director of Computer Technologies program, and I want to tell you about my 4-minute mile story. About 20 years ago, I started to lose my vision. After 11 eye surgeries and a year and a half, I ended up with about a quarter of my former vision. After that point, I passed the day sitting in a chair at home, not thinking about the future. I had no thoughts of how to overcome my disability, no thoughts of returning to work, no hopes, no dreams, no happiness, no sadness, no nothing. Just sat there. It was more about simple survival. Try cooking without being able to see what you're doing. Try cutting your nails if you aren't looking at your hands. Not a single thought of returning to work, not even the idea that I could work again. Eventually, somebody suggested that I visit Lighthouse for the Blind, which I did. I explained my situation to the good folks there, and they asked me a question. They asked me why I thought I could not work. And that was a good question. That was a very good question. It was such a good question that I ended up enrolling in the computer technologies program. And what I had to do was to learn a new way to work. Previously, I had worked in a very intuitive and disorganized way. And what I needed to do was to learn to be very organized. And I needed to follow specific procedures so that I could be successful in the field. And here's the point, the sub 4-minute mile. 20 years ago, I had no idea about working again professionally. It wasn't a thought, it wasn't a reality. But now that the barrier's been broken, so many things are possible for me. It's hard to remember why I thought I could not before. And that was my 4-minute mile. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you my co-presenter, Brittany Déjean.
Testing. Can you hear me okay? No? Is that okay? Better? Okay. Hi, I'm Brittany. I started off, like I'm assuming many of you in this room, with no personal connection to disability. I learned everything from experience. My dad was paralyzed in a car accident when I was 12 years old, and he's been living as a quadriplegic ever since. He's paralyzed from the chest down, and he can't move his fingers. On the left is a photo of my dad and I just a few months before his car accident. In the middle was the first day he was home after 6 months in rehabilitation hospital. And on the right, that's him wheeling me down the aisle at my wedding last June. So we were lucky to be able to get back to living a normal life after the situation, because we ended up living near one of the top spinal cord injury hospitals in the country. And they showed us quite early through mentors and other exposure that my dad would be able to live a normal life. He now lives independently. He's an electrical engineer, and he drives himself to work every day. Most importantly for me, he's just my dad. In the years since my dad's accident, I began to see how others regarded him. A waitress once asked me what my dad wanted to eat instead of asking him, and I've watched countless people stare over the years. But to me, disability is just a normal part of my family's life. That being said, we are some of the lucky ones who do live well with a disability. And there are more often than not barriers in accessing information on the family side, but also barriers in understanding in the rest of society. This inspired my life's work, my social enterprise, AbleThrive. On one side, we curate and organize resources for living well with a disability for families like my own to find resources more easily. And on the other side, we get disability to be included in the diversity dialogue along with race, gender, and sexual orientation through inclusion consulting services for companies with a greater goal of building a more inclusive society. I want everyone who ends up like my family or with some other disability to not only have the tools that they need to thrive, but also that the rest of society is prepared to accept them equitably. So today, Alex and I are going to challenge any assumptions that you may have about disability. And our goal is that by the end of the session, if you do have stress surrounding these kinds of interactions, that you'll feel 1,000,000 times better and open you up to enjoying the rest of today with a different perspective on disability in general. And so, to you, Alex.
So let's just change gears for a minute.
So let's make sure it's working. Can you hear him okay?
Check, check.
Oh.
I just have to talk really loud. So let's change gears for a minute. Imagine somebody comes into your office for an interview, and you're surprised to see that they arrive in a huge wheelchair, and they have very limited mobility. And even more, when they speak to you, it's extremely difficult for you to understand what they're saying. If this happened, how would you feel? Imagine yourself in this situation, and how would you feel facing this person?
If the answer to that is anything along the lines of uncomfortable, you are not alone. When I talk to people with no disability experience about my work, it's led many people to start to share with me their most recent awkward or difficult or frustrating encounter that they've experienced talking to someone with a disability. And over time, I tend to hear the same 5 phrases or situations that come up again and again. So there's the sympathy-pity instinct. There's the unsurety of how or when to help. There's the assumptions of inability, and the accompanying emoji, obviously. There's the dread of misspeaking. And there's the guilt of discomfort. And if you have no personal experience with disability and all you've ever seen is mainstream media, it is completely understandable that you might feel this way. I have found that I have a role as someone without a disability to build bridges of understanding and foundations of communication between both sides of this divide. So by the end, we hope that you're going to be able to feel a lot more comfortable and not deal with these 5 feelings anymore. And you'll be better prepared to maximize the benefits of inclusion. So getting back to the idea of the job interview, Alex, what's the most important thing in a resume?
And I think it's education, it's experience, and it's accomplishments. So let's take a look at a resume. And let's take a look at this person's accomplishments. Co-founder of the first code academy for people with disabilities. Developed the core logic that drives Wells Fargo's transactions that's still used today. Raised round A venture capital for a startup after his retirement. And now spearheading career access to reform Social Security for people with disabilities. So obviously this person is highly successful, wouldn't you say? Yes, amazingly so. And in fact, this is that guy in the wheelchair who came into your office for that interview. Huge wheelchair, highly mobility impaired, and you can't understand any of the things he's saying to you. I talked to the person that he worked for at Wells Fargo, Ken Chrisman, and the quote I got was, at first I had reservations about how to communicate with him, but it didn't take long to get used to his speech. It also did not take long to learn how important his role was in my success. The reality of the situation is, this individual, the career that was suggested to him when he was young was working in a shop filling boxes with toothpicks, sheltered workshop making sub-minimum wage.
So Neal's story might make you wonder what you might be missing if you're making assumptions based on disability. Because clearly if Neal had ended up putting toothpicks in a box, he would not have been able to have all of those accomplishments that we just listed for you. So I have just 5 small things that you can do starting from right now to completely restructure how you perceive and engage with people with disabilities. So step 1 is to opt for empathy. So I want you to think for a second, how many of you have ever been the recipient of pity or sympathy? Okay, so then think for a second how that made you feel. There's a knee-jerk reaction to giving people with disabilities sympathy and pity. But if that's all people with disabilities ever get from society, they're inevitably not being seen as equals. Think of something that you might have experienced when you received that sympathy or pity. Maybe a loss, losing a job, a divorce, something like that. Would you want to be defined by that or have that be all that you're seen for? The things we go through in our identities are just one part of who we are, not what defines us. My friend Erin puts it best. Just because I can't walk doesn't mean I can't be understanding of a friend's painful toe. Getting frustrated is about as helpful as pity, but empathy is something that helps us be united as humans, no matter what we've gone through. So we don't need to necessarily have this or share the same experiences with those around us to be understanding of different circumstances. The second step is to ask before you help. So this is my dad. If you saw him like this, would you assume that he needs help? My dad likes to push himself up ramps, even if they're steep. He likes it because he likes the challenge and he likes the exercise. So if I'm with him, I'll ask if he needs help, but more often than not, he will say no. But then there's the people around us who look at me with death eyes like I am the worst human being on the planet because I'm letting this poor man in a wheelchair go up the ramp by himself. And sometimes they'll even run from, you didn't even see him coming, millions of miles away, and they run up and they start pushing my dad without saying a word. Now, this is a problem for two main reasons. One, my dad has not been given the chance to speak for himself. And two, my dad doesn't have abdominal muscle strength. So if he accelerates quickly in his wheelchair and he's not expecting it, it can actually throw him out of his chair. That's not a pretty sight either. So now, these are well-intentioned people. But instead of helping, they're actually treating my dad differently on the basis of his disability and also putting him in an unsafe situation. So just imagine if you were to see someone without a disability or without a visible disability who looks like they need help, what do you do? The socially accepted standard is to ask before you act, in any case. So if you're not sure how or if you should help someone with a disability, start by asking whether you would offer that help to someone without one. If you would, go ahead and ask. If they say yes, ask how you can help. But if they say no, accept that they know their situation better than you do. Step 3 is don't assume that you know what someone can or can't do. We already do this naturally with pretty much everyone else we interact with. So because of the antiquated perceptions of disability that we tend to see in mainstream media, people often jump to assumptions on that negative frame. But if you shift your frame of perception of ability, you can start to ask instead what someone can do. And again, this is more in line with how we operate with interacting with others naturally. So we don't typically start a job interview, for example, having already assumed in our head what that person can't do. And Alex has a story from from their organization that demonstrates this.
We had a student recently, his name is Alfonso, and his career was truck driving. Unfortunately, he developed a degenerative disease, and that ended his career as a truck driver. He enrolled in our school, but he had really serious doubts about his ability to succeed because he had literally never used a computer before. So he enrolled in our computer skills bootcamp class, and he really did great. And he did great because he was such a hard worker, such a great work ethic. So at the end of that class, we encouraged him to enroll in our computer technician training. Normally, we don't encourage anyone to go into that training program if they don't have extensive computer experience. It's just usually not realistic. But because his work ethic was so strong and his personality was so nice, we really thought it was going to be possible for him. Throughout the whole program, he really expressed a great deal of doubts about his ability to be successful in the field. And even though he got great marks in school, he still had his doubts. Even though he got a great review on his internship, he still had his doubts. And he had strong doubts up until the day that he was hired. Now that he's on the job, his employer has seen some of the great qualities that we identified with him in our school.
Okay, so leaving that door open for someone to demonstrate what they're able to do maximizes someone's abilities, but it's also more in line with what we do normally. So the fourth step is to prepare your workforce. So if you are ready to or are already promoting inclusion in the workplace, make sure that any future employee or customer is entering an environment where he or she feels safe and welcome. Even if the decision makers of a company are on board with inclusion, there's still inevitably people in the workforce who are going to harbor some of those misconceptions, the first 5 emojis I showed, that's going to impact their ability to engage with a colleague. And as I mentioned, it's not their fault necessarily that's what's their exposure has been. So you can avoid a potentially tense or awkward environment, or even potentially losing that new employee with a disability, by taking steps ahead to ensure that you can recreate a safe space that allows your workforce to express their discomforts and assumptions, so that they too can move beyond them and shift their perspective so that they're ready to work with that person. That can include redoing a conversation like this one, or any other kind of inclusion consulting that will proactively engage your workforce, which is 1,000,000 times better than picking up the pieces after something bad happens. And last but not least, remember that first and foremost, you're talking to a human being. Engaging people with disabilities does not require a new structure of interacting with humans. And if you're nervous or in doubt, a good rule of thumb is to ask yourself what you would do if that person did not have a disability. So if you're curious to ask something, but you're not sure if you should, ask if you would ask for that person if they didn't have a disability. Or maybe ask yourself if it's something you need to know at that time. People with disabilities are incredibly diverse and have very, very different perspectives on how they speak about their disability, if they speak about it at all. And your job is just to honor that diversity. You don't necessarily need to know. Or it doesn't necessarily impact whether or not that person would be a suitable hire. Keep in mind that in a hiring environment in particular, people may be wary of being judged on the basis of their disability, so it could create a tense situation. Make an effort first and foremost just to treat someone with a disability as you would anyone else, and let the conversation flow. Be sure that you ask at the end what you can do to make their experience working for you more comfortable. And I would argue that's a question you should be asking of every single employee in your workforce. And in terms of, for example, if you wouldn't lower your standards for a woman or a person of color, then don't lower your standards for people with disabilities. Treat them as you would anyone else. So with these 5 steps, opt for empathy, ask before you help, don't assume you know someone's abilities, prepare your workforce, and remember that you're engaging with a human being. You have the power to shift your perspective. Rather than have interactions with people with disabilities be full of stress, you're ready for normal human interactions. And here's how we can remedy the situation we were in before. So rather than feeling sympathy, you can recognize that you can empathize with someone's situation. Rather than trying to figure out on your own what someone, whether or not they need help, you can be confident in knowing that you'll be there and helping if they need it. Rather than assume you know what someone is capable of, you can leave yourself open to learning what they're able to do. Rather than being worried that you might say the wrong thing, fall back on the golden rule and treat others as you want to, how you want to be treated. And lastly, if rather than feel awkward around people with disabilities, feel confident in the idea that you're just with another human being. It's not rocket science. There is no special code or secret language or things that you are so expected to already know. Just extend how the social norms that guide how you interact with people in general to include people with disabilities, rather than think you have to learn a new system, and you'll be just fine.
The 4-minute mile, once thought impossible, is now achievable. In my life, returning to work seemed unimaginable, and now I work far too much. For Neal Jacobson, he refused to accept what others had in mind for him. For Alfonso, hard work and our belief in him made all the difference. Disability is often a superficial barrier to success. I really hope you enjoy your day, and we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do much on racial stuff, so I'm not necessarily well versed in that. But in terms of the issue of singling someone out, um, I think I think in general, most likely there are people in a lot of existing workforces that deal with things that others don't see, especially a lot of people with visible disabilities or other issues. So if you're bringing in someone with a disability, I think it's not necessarily the first one. It might just be the first one that might be more obvious, for example, or something like that. But I think as a company, rather than saying we're just doing this because there's this guy or this woman coming, that could be the impetus to start that as a corporate practice or as a practice within the company to make sure people are comfortable. And for even like existing employees or down the line, like something like where you are just kind of putting out a general thing to get people on board with a decision being made to go there, to be inclusive, to be open and accepting. What might be beneficial is then moving forward, as you have different groups, check in with your women, check in with groups that might represent a certain race or disability, say, how are we doing this okay? Are we, it doesn't have to all happen at once. But when employers are seen as taking that step and making that effort, I think that goes a long way. But you got to start with a foundation. You have to build from there based on like the circumstances and like the specific circumstances of a company. I don't know if you
And
want
I'd like to add, I think people generally know what to do once they get started with it. And in the workforce or just in life in general, people with disabilities often face a greater sense of isolation than others, real or perceived. Someone who's blind, okay, they're carrying a white cane. We're not quite sure about this person. We don't know how to communicate with them. It feels a little uncomfortable, so we avoid them. And then, well, they're just left out of the conversation. Someone who's deaf, I'm wondering, how will I be able to communicate with them? I don't know how to start the conversation. And so they get left out. So you have to just, it's important to stay aware of that sense of isolation that people may have. And so what do we do in business? At the beginning of a meeting, introduce everybody. Someone comes into a new environment to make sure they know who's there. And once you get that conversation started, it often just goes well naturally. But for me, I just would simply say asking is almost always just going to be okay. I do understand what you mean by kind of making it their responsibility and feeling like they have to be an expert in themselves and disability and how they're going to fit into your company. But my feeling is generally asking is going to be okay.
And I think just to add onto that quickly, like if that's a company practice, that's less of singling someone out. So if you were, because again, just because you would ask one person with a disability might make you feel like you're just singling them out. But if that's a company practice to every few months check in with your employees, whatever, maybe in a check-in, that's a question. How are we doing on making you feel included in this environment? And it's known that your company stands by those ideals. I don't think it would feel as much singling out. And I agree, the asking, they might say no, but just asking what you can do doesn't give them a responsibility other than to answer that question. And if they seem interested, then you could work with that person on an individual level. If they're not, you take what they say and you can carry that forward.
Sorry, just to add in, I'd also, I'd say I would let them know if it's feeling uncomfortable, to let them know that it's a process. that accommodation or integration isn't just a one-time event. It's something that will be an ongoing process. So if you ask the question once and they say no, well, the answer could be different next time. I think it's very individual, so I couldn't easily say what best practice is. In this hypothetical example is a real example. Neal Jacobson is a man who is here at the conference that I worked with for a year. Some people over time are able to understand him much more easily than others. I have a minor hearing impairment myself, so it is especially challenging for me to understand him. But he understands that, and so he has no problem. I have to ask him to repeat what he said 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Once it's getting to be 5 times right, we're getting a little frustrated naturally, right? And so we may ask someone else to informally interpret for him. So I guess it depends on the severity and the individual situation. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, because I think also if the foundation of all of it is that you're dealing with a human being, it takes away a lot of that anxiety because the person can be understanding. They're going to know that they have a certain challenge with speech, but when they're being dealt with by someone who's not awkwardly trying to understand, but like, okay, let's find a way to solve this problem. It's really that empathetic foundation that can make both parties more comfortable. And then personally, on our team, I have someone, for AbleThrive, I have someone who I have a very difficult time understanding, and we tend to work remotely, so I don't even necessarily get the in-person time to really get used to it. And so what I actually went and spoke to another woman on my team who has worked with different people with disabilities and has one herself, and I asked her in confidence, but in guidance, this isn't something I deal with all the time. How have you managed this with people in the past? I wanted some tools from someone that knew. And so, for example, I just brought him on the team maybe 2 weeks ago, and we Skyped. I spoke, he typed. And so when you find, and that worked best for us because he was a faster typer than speaker, and it allowed us to get across the points that I needed to get across, and we were able to communicate just fine. And that was actually a solution that my other teammate had used when she spoke with someone else. But it can be a conversation via email or in some other way. Again, when the foundation is set and people are being seen, as human beings, to say, okay, what would make the most sense to have your voice heard and to be participating in this? And again, that's a later stage conversation than getting someone on board, but eventually people are naturally, a lot of times in these environments, problem solvers. And so when you're dealing with that, again, another human being, it's just solving a problem of communication that you might have with any sort of employee, not necessarily one with a disability. One more question? Okay. We have one here.
My name is Alex Tabony, Director of Computer Technologies Program. We're a computer training program just upstairs here in this building. We provide computer training for people with disabilities, and our purpose as a nonprofit organization is to help people with disabilities get jobs and then develop their career once they're placed. On your second part, we work with many employers, and I would say that it's really extremely varied in our experience. Generally, it is Sam was talking about mentors and allies. What we found in many cases where there did need to be some kind of assistance, intervention, the ally or the mentor who was there on the job with our student was the person who would communicate and most effectively get things done. Sometimes we get messages from other people in the company. It's not necessarily something we can directly act on, though. We don't have that. They're not in the right position to help. Basically, that mentor is going to do what it takes, find the right people, make the right connections to solve the problem.
And for me, so I'm founder and executive director of AbleThrive, and we have a website at AbleThrive.com where we curate different resources for living well with a disability from a network of right now over 100 individuals, organizations, companies, and hospitals to give people a starting point to understand how to live well with a disability and be exposed to people living well in their situation. And then on the other half of that, we've begun kind of working on this issue of I really love the gap between people with and without disabilities and targeting that frustration, honestly, on both sides as someone who doesn't have a disability but grew up with my dad to help build those bridges. And so I actually have been trying to often find that person you're speaking about, and I agree with Alex that it can be extremely varied. If the company has a D&I, a diversity and inclusion head, they're usually at least a safe conversation to start. They might have zero clue about disability, but they're supposed to care, so they'll usually give you an ear. If a company, so I'll start there if I don't have any sort of contact in the company. If they don't have a diversity and inclusion head, I found that it's not even necessarily an ally with a disability, but someone who will listen to me. So I use the privilege that I can get into spaces that some people with disabilities aren't necessarily welcomed, and then I talk about what I do. And then when I find this has worked, sometimes people are like, oh, that's nice, little girl, like, I'm gonna go back to my office now. And sometimes people are like, huh, you know, I've never seen someone with a wheelchair in this building. Why is that? And that happened that man who did this was because I got them to help us on a consulting project, which they didn't have to have disability experience to do it. And by the end, they were requesting a proposal from us to help assess whether or not they could, accessibility-wise, have someone with a disability, and empathy and interaction-wise, make sure that they'd be able to do it, because they became really committed to wanting to have inclusive hiring. So it's kind of just, I agree, there's really yet no pathway, but that's kind of been what's happened for me.
Okay, I guess we're out of time, but thank you all very much for coming to our session.
Thank you.
I hope that you have a great day here.